Jeff is a professor emeritus and former chair of the Department of Geology and the founding director of the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis. He received the Distinguished Scholarly Public Research Award for his contributions on issues of public concern such as flood risk, watershed management, and river restoration. At UC Davis, he directed research projects on restoring salmon to the North Coast streams, restoring lowland floodplains and mountain meadows, and managing Sierra hydropower systems in response to climate change. And also alternative futures for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. He has published more than 100 articles, books, and other publications, including his seminal book entitled California Rivers and Streams. And since 2015, he has been a senior fellow with the Water Policy Center at the Policy Institute of California. And I could go on for the next hour talking about all the amazing research he's done and all the awards he's been receiving over the last 45 years. Oh. How old are you? But then you would have time to hear him enlighten us on the critical watershed issues that face us. So I won't steal any more of his time. Very much like you to meet Jeff Mount, and who will speak on priorities for California water, thriving for less.
By the way, it is a pleasure to be speaking in a classroom full of adults. So I do have a long career because I finished my PhD in 1980 and drove from Santa Cruz to Davis and started my first and did my first lecture in my first class. So I didn't do the postdoc or any of that stuff. I was 25 and it was an accident. There were just so many great positions in my field open. I was going to win one of them. So I won the UC Davis Prize. All right, well, today I'm going to reflect not my history as a geologist, but my interest in public policy and public policy issues. And to some of you, this will sound kind of familiar. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, just like Tom, and a physical scientist at that. But what happened is, as I went on and on in my career, and my attention span got shorter and shorter, I got really interested in public policy because you really only need a short attention span to deal with public policy. Because it changes constantly. And so it turned out to be what Colin Powell would call a target-rich environment and a great place to work, especially on water here in California. What I wanted to do today was kind of roar through a big synoptic view of water in California and the major issues. And I want to start with why we manage water. I mean, sometimes you have to remind people why we manage water, why we have such elaborate systems to manage water. I want to give California in context. We are unique in so many different ways. And I want to talk a little bit about how water is managed today. The focus of today's talk is principally on scarcity, managing water scarcity. Right now, we don't have that problem, or maybe we do. And in fact, I'm looking forward to a discussion about that. The question is the drought over? But adapting to scarcity as well as floods. And then I want to just review for the status of the three sectors. And this is really important to know that these are the three sectors that all pull on each other. And this is water for communities, water for farms, and water for the environment. And then I'm going to wrap up with the theme and repeat the theme. We have to learn to live with less. That's the bottom line theme of this entire talk, is we have to start learning to live with less water. That's going to be the key. Okay, why do we manage water in the first place? I mean, there's, like today, there's so much of it, but of course, it's so irregularly distributed in California. 75% of the precipitation in California falls north of this point on the map. 75% of the use of water in California is south of this point on the map. So, so it's, the gods were not kind in the distribution of water in California. It's always somewhere else. And of course, it varies dramatically temporally, in time. I mean, last year versus this year, or worse yet, even the year before that is a classic example. But also there's issues in water that are really important to public safety. I'm not going to touch a lot on those today, but I remind you, we don't want to drink polluted water. And we used to drink a lot of polluted water in California. We really made great strides in that thing. Of course, we have floods. We had $1 billion worth of damage this year alone associated with flooding. And that's small, by the way. That's a small number. And of course, droughts lead to questions about food security. And so food security is really, really important. And then I also want to remind you, water is a public good. It is enshrined in the state constitution as belonging to you, the public. It does not belong to anyone. It is a public good, which is something we need to understand. There is a human right to water. We've established that. That's state policy. Of course, without water, we have no ecosystems in this state. I mean, well, we have ecosystems we wouldn't like if we didn't have much water. Of course, there's tremendous amounts. I love living in California. The recreational benefits here have been terrific. Best thing I ever did was take that job at UC Davis, and everybody thinks, oh, all the great academic. No, I could go out and go whitewater kayaking in an hour from school. Great place to work. And then, but the tension is water is also a private commodity. I mean, it generates wealth, and we trade it. We buy and we sell it. So this is why we have to manage it. Okay. I can tell you, I give talks around the country, and I always have to remind people how unique California is, and they always snicker when I say that. Yes, we're unique in many ways, but nobody comes close to us in the variability of climate. We are the most variable climate in North America when it comes to precipitation, period. Nothing comes close. Our year-to-year variability, and including, even our annual variability. I mean, come on, we have a drought. It starts every year about May, and then it hopefully ends in November, right? I mean, so we have an annual drought, and then we get these extended droughts, this 3-year drought we just had, the 4-year drought we just had before that, and the 6-year drought starting in the late 80s. So we get drought, and then we get these, what I call Noachian deluges, where we get these atmospheric river families that come in and dump so much rain on us. It's so variable, and that variability is the underlying challenge in managing water in California, and that variability. And I want to just roll through how we adapt to this. There's 5 things we do to adapt to this extreme variability in water. And of course, the one that is the most obvious, what people call gray infrastructure, is our surface storage. I mean, in California, we have more than 1,400 reservoirs within California that hold about 40 million acre feet. You know, everybody gets all hot and bothered about an acre footage. Just think of an acre with 1 foot of water on it. And that's the standard measurement for water. And that surface storage is essential. We could not live and work in California without that surface storage. And by the way, I love this picture. This is 1997. This is January 5th, I think, 1997, around then, which those of you, I love talking to a room full of adults. Most of you were here. You all remember this. This is before the internet really took, okay, never mind. But they surface storage. I mean, we got to see it really get tested in 1997. And yes, it kind of blew up. We had flooding all over the Central Valley in 97. If you remember, we had more than 20 levee breaks south of the Delta. The Cosumnes did its usual blow up and fall apart, which it just did this year as an example. And then, of course, we had the largest evacuation in history below this dam because they were afraid of what was going on. This is 1997. Well, turn around and just a few years later, 2017, that system broke and really highlighted how important this infrastructure is, because that then became the largest evacuation in the history of California until the Camp Fire. And at the Camp Fire, that was the biggest. I mean, 200,000 people had to get up and move. That's pretty substantial stuff. But what we forget about is we have designed a system here that with surface storage in which we build in snowpack. That snowpack is absolutely essential for how we manage water and store water in California. This is the status today. So these are 28, this is the storage in 28 western slope reservoirs of the Sierra. Then the northern reservoirs plus snowpack. That additional snowpack saves us billions of dollars in investment in water. And indeed, the farm production that we have here in the Central Valley relies so heavily on that snowpack. About 30% of our total supply comes from snowpack. So and then this year, we have a wicked good snowpack. This is a really good snowpack in the Central Sierras and the Southern Sierras. We can talk all about hydrologic details in the Q&A. But that is essential for operating our reservoirs. The reason is it's not just that it's storage, is on April 1st, it starts releasing its storage at the very time we have the highest demand for water, because that's when the irrigation season starts in California. And of course, without surface storage, we would have lots of problems with flooding. Let's take Folsom Dam, which of course, again, you guys have all been around since 97, so you know exactly that things were pretty rotten, and we discovered that Folsom Dam is a perfectly terrible flood control dam. And we had to make more than $1 billion worth of modifications to the dam to make it better, better. But we get flooding. Flooding is a common occurrence here in California. Without that storage, we'd have a whole lot more flooding in the process. But I do want to remind that adaptation of surface storage is in constant tension. If you want a good flood control structure, if you want Folsom to be a good flood control structure, empty it. Keep it at 0. It'll do a great job. If you want it to be a water supply structure, you fill it as high as you possibly can. You want it to do hydropower, okay, that tension is one of the great challenges in terms of managing these large dams. But that's not it in terms of storage. And this is the part that's been invisible in our discussions up until just a few years ago. And that is groundwater, or the ability to store water in the ground, is our really big storage. That is right now sitting empty with no water in it at all in the Central Valley alone is 3 times the amount of surface storage that we have. Take all the dams together. You could take them all, take all their water and put it 3 times into the Central Valley and you'd never see it. It wouldn't come to the surface. There's that much empty storage. And of course, the reason there's so much empty storage is we have not managed groundwater well. We have been mining it basically for the last 100 years, which is what's created this storage. So unsustainable use of groundwater has been a big problem. But I got to tell you, groundwater is our drought reserve. About 33% of our annual supply comes from groundwater. During a drought, 2/3 of our water comes from groundwater. Okay, remember, most of that goes to irrigation, but that's where most water goes anyways. The other adaptation we don't think about is we're part of a grid. There is this very large, complex, in fact, probably the world's 2nd most complex grid, water grid in California. And again, this 75% of the precipitation north and 75% of the precipitation south of this room requires a very elaborate conveyance grid. So these conveyance systems are absolutely essential for water in California, particularly getting water to Southern California and the Bay Area. Without this grid system, you could not have sustained growth in the Bay Area and growth in Southern California. And by the way, that's 98% of our economy is wrapped up in those two areas. So without this grid, to give you an example, if you're sitting in San Diego and you have a glass of water in San Diego, you're drinking water that came out of the Klamath River. They said a tributary to the Klamath River, the Trinity River, and you're drinking water that came from the west slope of the Rocky Mountains. It came down the Colorado into that area. And you're drinking a substantial amount of water that you probably flushed down your toilet some time ago if you're in San Diego. So you recycle a lot of that water. Ooh, I can hear you. Uh-oh. Give me the hand. I feel terrible for those people. Speaker. With apologies for those of you who are online, if you couldn't hear me. So this will be easier and I'll talk really fast. Okay, so what I was explaining here is that we have a grid and it is a lot like our electricity grid, but we're just using water molecules instead of electrons. And water moves tremendous distances because, as Mark Reisner said in Cadillac Desert, water flows uphill to money. Okay, so water has extremely high value in the 2 parts of the here in Southern California and here in Bay Area, which is why we have these immense and elaborate multi-billion-dollar conveyance systems. I mean, as you know, the largest electricity user in the state is the Department of Water Resources. And that is the State Water Project, which pumps water over the hill, over the Tehachapi's into Southern California. That's the biggest single electricity user. So, but that's not it. I mean, it's just, so right there, this is the managed water question. We also have an elaborate system where we are, part of our adaptation is how we allocate water. So we have this, what to most of us, even us in this room, think is a pretty creaky old water rights system. It developed in 1913, really began in 1914. So it's more than 100 years old. And that water rights system is basically the way we allocate water in California. And that is first in time, first in right. So if you were there first using it, you can use it. As long as you continue to make beneficial use of that water, you can continue to use it. And this is what we're fighting about. And by the way, I want to remind you, water flows uphill to money. Money solves a lot of problems in water. But again, it must be reasonable the way you use it in our water rights system.
The other thing that's growing, but it's got a long way to go, is we actually have a market that is developing in water, and that is ability to move water from low revenue uses to high revenue uses. And that market and trading, it's really small. It's less than 10% of the water. In fact, it's probably closer to like 7% of the water is involved in markets, but it's growing and becoming increasingly important because that's how you deal with scarcity, to reduce the economic impacts of scarcity. And then finally, the fifth part of this is we have a bunch of laws that try to keep us from doing bad things. And first of all is the reminder, water is a public trust resource. And the State Water Resources Control Board, my wife used to be the head of water rights there. You can imagine the dinner time conversations. She's retired. She got out of there. Couldn't have been a more unpopular person in the last drought than my wife, who's actually a lovely, sweet person. She's going to join you all and become part of your society here, as will I. She had to administer this question of public trust, and the trade-offs that exist are public trust uses like economic uses of water, but also water for the environment. So layered on top of that are, of course, these now almost 50-year-old landmark laws, which would be the Federal and State Endangered Species Act and the Federal and State Clean Water Act, and a whole lot more on top of it. So we have a whole lot of laws that basically govern it. So those are our 5 adaptations: storage, surface storage, groundwater storage, a grid, a water rights system, which basically tries to bring order out of the chaos in the way we manage it, and then a series of laws that basically, as I'll point out here, constrain the way we use water. All right, so this is a question I always get, is who uses how much? I am just updating all this fact sheet, and it'll be out this spring. And there will be I'll get a ton of hate mail. Fortunately, all hate mail seems to get intercepted by the PPIC spam filter. I never see it. So here's the way water is laid out. And this is the Department of Water Resources faulty accounting system. And if you want a long lecture on why they messed it up, actually, we've written a bunch about this, but this is the way they account. So cities, which account for roughly 98% of our economy, cities use about 10% of the surface water. Agriculture uses about 40% of surface water, and then the rest is assigned to the environment. So in a year like this, where it rains like hell and water goes off the basins and makes its way out to San Francisco, it's all charged to the environment. And the thing I want you to notice when you hear somebody say, well, the environment takes 50% of the water, that's usually because they haven't done their homework. Here's the reason. See this right here? That's the North Coast. Those are a series of rivers where nobody's using any of the water, and it runs off, and it's also the rainiest spot. That's our temperate rainforest. And all that water that runs off from the North Coast is assigned to the environment. So when someone says the environment's using 50% of the water, ask them, well, how much is it using in our region? And you're going to get a very different answer, particularly depending on what year type it is. There is virtually no environmental water in very dry years. All of the water is consumed. So don't buy into this notion of water wasted to the sea. That would be a very long lecture from me. It always creates benefit. It just may not be the benefit you want. Okay, so how's all this working? Okay, this is sort of the policy side of this. So how's all this working here in California? Okay, I want to tell you, it actually worked pretty well. And one would argue it is still working. My colleagues and I remind each other that to the chagrin of the New York Times, we're fine. We didn't dry up and die in the streets of LA, which is what the Times would love. And sometimes the Washington Post too. I mean, they love it. They love the misery in California, and I can't pronounce it. Schadenfreude, if I got that right, Fraude. They love misery in California. So it's so funny how I get quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post only if I say something awful. If I say, actually, we're all right. Oh, well, I don't want to talk to you. So, and I'm used to that over the years. But we are dealing with significant and possibly dramatic changes. And the switch flipped in about the year 2000. It really started in the 1980s, but really flipped in about the year 2000. And we became the land of the hot drought. And drought has always been a signature of California. But what happened is things just gotten a whole lot warmer. And as you all remember from your introduction to the hydrologic cycle, it's driven by temperature as much as it is by precipitation. And again, temperature tends to drive high rates of evaporation or evapotranspiration on plants and actually speeds up the hydrologic cycle. And that has had a huge effect on California. And I want to give you the culprit, and you can go home and ask if anybody knows about it. There is a property of the atmosphere called evaporative demand. We've moved away from talking about evapotranspiration to evaporative demand. When the water comes in off the Pacific Ocean, it has a certain amount of vapor within it. It has a certain amount of temperature. There's a certain amount of solar radiation working on it, and there's a certain amount of wind. When those four factors combine to create what's called evaporative demand. And I have been round and around in this with my colleagues in the research fields up and down, throughout the US, and we all have come to the same conclusion. Something has changed. And what has changed is evaporative demand, which is colloquially known as the thirst of the atmosphere, has increased. And 2021 was the all-time shocker for us. And you guys may all remember 2021. It was a pretty miserable, this is the year that broke our water supply system in the Central Valley. And I can talk more about that if you guys want, but this is what has happened. And there's 2021 here. See this cluster, 1980 to 2000. This is the natural variability of atmospheric demand, evaporative demand. And what you see in these really years with very, very low evaporative demand, those are our wet years, like 1983 and 1998, two El Nino years where we just had absolutely saturated atmosphere. Demand was very low because the water vapor was so high. But there's 2021 right there. There's 2022, which we thought was going to be kind of like it might be normal. Nope, it wasn't normal. It's still above the long-term average. So this evaporative demand is the most demonstrable climate change signature that we have in California. Okay, I don't think this winter is a climate change phenomenon, by the way. This is just kind of the natural variability of this crazy place. But this phenomena is a climate change signature. You know, you're not going to get consensus on that, right? But the overwhelming majority of those people who work on the impact of climate change here in California will say, yeah, this is a climate change signature. It fits in so many ways. But it's these array of climate change issues that are beginning to show, which is really going to be a challenge for those 5 things I told you about that we're using to manage water. And of course, warming temperatures are part of that, which is part of that evaporative demand. Ever shrinking snowpack, except this year. Oh my goodness, what a great year for snow. Changing wet season, and I'll just give you a diagram that shows that more volatile precipitation. A term has emerged called climate whiplash. Just simply because of these rapid changes. And don't forget, rising oceans have an impact on water management. They have a significant. Okay, so warmth, remember, drives the hydrologic cycle, drives evaporative demand, dries out things. This evaporative demand and warmth is a major driver of the 16 million trees we just lost last year. So these tree deaths are driven in large measure by that because of the drying out of soils. Loss of snowpack. Remember I said that we rely on snowpack as part of our surface storage. So one of the things that happened in 2021 and 2022 is the snowpack was so skinny and then it just disappeared. It just literally went away in the spring instead of slowly melting off and providing snow. And so people who managed water supply systems were caught flat-footed by that change. And there were a lot of really negative things happen by not having that snow melt. The other thing that's starting to appear is shorter wet season. Now, this will sound familiar to you. And what we're starting to see is increased concentration of precipitation into fewer and fewer days. December, January, February, when it used to be late October, November, December, January, February, March, and early April. So we're starting to see this change. And that is very consistent with the climate models that are being used right now. So this produces a real, it's good if you're a farmer, you get into your fields earlier and you might get 2 crops in, or 3 if you're growing alfalfa, for example. But the fact is, it's really tough for management to get it all at once, kind of like we did last week of December, first 3 weeks of January this year. We got a whole year worth of precipitation squeezed into 4 weeks. So this is a phenomenon that people are worried might start appearing much more often. The big thing that has folks like me worried is increasing volatility. This is drier dries and wetter wets. The wetter wets make sense, right? If you've got a warmer atmosphere, it can hold more water, so that these atmospheric rivers are going to have more punch. You will then start a fight amongst the atmospheric river research crowd about whether they are in fact more intense now than they used to be. And it's a good fight. And the reason it's a good fight is the scientific uncertainty is high. But all of the modeling is pointing to an increased volatility as we go forward. And here's the thing, and rising sea level, delta. My goodness, the delta is a tidal estuary. Rising sea level is really tough on the delta, also tough on all these coastal aquifers that we have in Southern California, and it's really rough on the Bay Area, the management of the Bay Area. So all of this feeds into the management of these three things: the communities, farms, and the environment. And I lump them all together here, and then I'm going to tease them apart, because what happens in one affects the other. If farm demand goes up, there is competition for water with the cities, and both of them are trying to extract more water out of the environment. Environmental regulations change, it has an impact on both of them. So you cannot fully disentangle all three, especially because we have this massive grid, which moves water around great distances. But these changes are really posing challenges here. And I want to say it now, and I'll say it again and say it again. All our work at the Public Policy Institute of California with our collaborators in our very elaborate research network, which has done a lot of climate change modeling work and trying to figure out, have come up to the same conclusion. And the governor basically chose a number last summer, which I always thought we all laughed like, where'd that number come from? The governor said 10%. By 2040, we're going to see 10% less available supply. Well, it kind of depends on where you are. And I'm going to give you a number which is even different than that. But the point is, everybody is saying we're going to have less reliable, less abundant supplies. How do we thrive in California with less? And my argument is we're going to be fine. I know you didn't expect Dr. Doom. Oh, God, I can tell you, I used to be called Dr. Doom. Tamara Keith, back when she was reporting for NPR out here, took me out one day and we walked around levees in the Delta, and I went, oh, that's going to fail. Oh, that's no good. She said, I think I'll call you Dr. Doom. And I thought it was really funny. And the next morning, at NPR, morning edition, this is Tamara Keith in California. I'm interviewing Dr. Doom, Jeffrey Mount. My mother was so proud. So I'm actually not going to do a doomy, gloomy ending. I'm going to say, I think they're actually going to be fine. It's just going to take a lot of work and money to make it happen. So all these sectors are being stressed by this, and all sectors need to adapt. I want to just disabuse you of one thing. You will often hear, but population growth is going to outstrip the amount of water we have. This is really terrible. And when you think back to 1990, since 1990, we've had 150% increase in population in California. My God, it keeps going and going. We're just going to run out of water because of too many people. And I don't think so. I really don't think so. And here's why. Here's how much water we use in California all the way back to 1960. And again, we've had 150% increase in the population. Our agricultural, I'm going to jump on agriculture in just a second here when I talk about agriculture has become so economically efficient in California. And this is in today's dollars, for every gallon that agriculture uses, it now gets back 4 times the economic value it did back in 1960. So agriculture is just becoming more economically efficient with water, and we as people are becoming more economically efficient with water. Think about it. Since 1995, we're using substantially less water, and yet we've added almost 10 million people since 1995. This is a phenomenon that we really have to pay attention to and is real. And here, in fact, Southern California Metropolitan Water District in some circles is referred to as the Great Satan in Southern California, especially you people up here think you own this water. Remember, you don't own it. Nobody owns the water. And so they have the most sophisticated, largest water district in the world in terms of the number of people that they serve. And they are very sophisticated, and they're constantly updating their projections for the future. And we went back and got all their old projections back from 1996 on up through 2016, and they're about to release their updated projections. Year in, year out, their projections for the amount of water they needed are going down. And in 2016, they were basically flat. And we just redid their projections, and we think they're actually going to be using less water in Southern California than they are today. There's the possibility that in the future, out toward 2040, it'll be about the same water. This is why you didn't quietly hear Metropolitan Water District say, you know, we don't think we need more water from the Delta. Nobody heard that, by the way. They kind of slipped that out into a bulletin. So actual demand has been steadily declining. We are becoming more efficient with our use of water all the time. It has some perils, by the way, as you might imagine. And of course, the thing is, if there was a slogan from the Brown administration during the last drought, it was kill your lawn, right? I mean, Jerry Brown hated lawns. I actually was with him a couple of times when he was just spitting fire over lawns. He hates lawns. My dogs disagree. But the fact is, we still got a lot of room to adjust. We can grow a tremendous amount. And you all have seen the latest growth projections for California. It's really flat. In fact, people are leaving. I mean, so we're seeing an actual decline in population in California in the last few years. So I am surprisingly sanguine about this for a guy with a nickname Dr. Doom. Okay, so the communities are adapting, but here's a short list of the things, and I don't want to take too much time in this since I screwed up in the beginning with the AV. But one of the things, that first one, balancing, one of the things that people really worry about is as we shrink the amount of gallons per day, that water will be taken as the proposals here are in Sacramento, and then used for growth, local community growth. The consequence of that is hardening demand. You could kill your lawn in a drought. You can't kill your neighbor in a drought. So if all the water, so what are the things that we have been seeing more and more is the smart communities really investing in diversifying their sources, their water portfolios, including interties to other areas, regional cooperative agreements with other areas, because they used to just fight with each other all the time. Lots of flexibility, surface water, groundwater, and a variety of other sources of water. Extremely important. The biggest challenge I see going forward in these communities is fiscal resilience. We have Proposition 218, which will not allow you to charge anybody any additional money unless they get a direct benefit from it. So it makes it very hard to do large water supply systems and to plan for the future. Makes it hard to raise the money. And then there are the vulnerable communities. Here in the Central Valley, as you know, you have lots of disadvantaged communities that are relatively poor, and they've lost their water sources. And although the state's putting a lot of money into it, so it's a big deal. And then in the cities themselves, you know, that your water bill is about the price of your cell phone. But if you can't afford your cell phone, you can't afford a water bill. So it's some really tough issues that we're going to face in how we deal with these vulnerable communities. The second, and I'm going to start moving through this quickly so we can get to Q&A. The big water user in California is agriculture, okay? And that agriculture requires water as a throughput. And it's like, you know, complaining about agriculture using all the water is like complaining that Silicon Valley is taking all the programmers. Okay, it's not, it's a throughput for their industry. I mean, you will not find me being a big cheerleader and defender of agriculture just because I'm in the Central Valley, but they use water. This is the most productive agricultural region in the world. In terms of the economic efficiency and return on a gallon of water, this is an amazing place to grow crops. And by the way, I really hate the exporting water thing. I mean, we hear, you know, well, they're exporting water to Saudi Arabia and exporting because, yeah, well, what car do you drive? Okay, you've done a pretty good job of importing water with that. And if you drink craft beer, they're amazing. They import immense amounts of water because they get somebody else to grow their hops and barley somewhere else, and then they import them into the state. So don't fall for that one. But I do want to say agriculture is extremely important at the local scale, and agriculture is in deep trouble when it comes to their water supplies. So the economy of the San Joaquin Valley, it's a big deal for jobs there. And we have recalculated what the shortages look like between now and 2040 for agriculture. And there are three things working against them: changes in climate, new regulations, which we're trying to seek a balance in water for the environment, as well as water for the farms. And then the fact they've been living off of unsustainably pumping groundwater for 100 years. And now, due to an act passed in 2014, they have to stop doing that. And that is going to be about a 20% reduction in available water in the San Joaquin Valley. And that's going to translate to a lot of fallow land. We're talking 900,000 acres of land will have to come out of production. It's going to vary tremendously throughout the valley. We can do it much smarter than just letting land go fallow and having massive dust storms and health issues, and then the impacts on local communities, particularly their economy. We can do it really a whole lot smarter. But the fact of the matter is we're going to have to fallow, because that's it. You can't just have people put in drip irrigation system and hope that works out, because the number one recharge source for groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley is irrigation. Literally, it's literally the irrigation of orchards and fields that does that. So it is a reminder that agricultural footprint in California is shrinking, and what that looks like is considerably less, and also some real big challenges ahead. So what we're seeing for what we've done a PPIC, you can find this, we just released this report this last week. Supply augmentation is great. This is an overstatement. At most, you can get rid of the deficit by about a quarter. Okay, so at most, you can get rid of it by a quarter, maybe more. But trading of surface water, moving it from low value uses to high value uses, high economic value, really softens the economic blow of fallowing that land. Productivity growth. We've made so much advances in the more crop per drop approaches. Thank you, University of California, Davis, which is one of the global leaders in that research. And I'm proud to say I'm part of that organization. It really can help out, and you got to cooperate, and they don't right now. You got to have regional cooperation and basically connection and trading. And that's what's going to make a big difference. Finally, the third sector is probably the most depressing one to work on, and that's my specialty, is working on the environmental sector. Biodiversity in California is in a state, freshwater biodiversity is a state of rapid decline. What I have pictured up here are the numbers of birds, crustacean, fishes, reptiles, and amphibians, which are in serious trouble in these various areas. And you'll notice how few of them are listed as endangered under federal and state law. And the reason is the listing of a species is very hard and suffused with politics. So all of these species should in some way, shape, or form be listed, but that's not going to happen, not in this lifetime. But that means they're in real serious trouble. And this decline is accelerated by changing climate. What's happening is they're losing drought resilience. This is my working hypothesis for why species which are so resilient to drought, I mean, they evolved with drought, are doing so poorly when we have droughts. And the reason is we're messing up their drought resilience. Let me give you 3 quick examples. You all know Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon hedges its bets by basically avoiding droughts, where 1/2 to 2/3 of their population is in the ocean when the drought comes along, and a portion of their population comes back. So if you wipe out one year, you got others are out there. So they're bet hedging by having others out in the ocean. Some have resistance to drought. One of my absolute favorite fish, because it's so unloved, is the Sacramento sucker. You have them here right next door. And the Sacramento sucker has physiological adaptations to extremely high temperatures, low oxygen, the kinds of things that go on during drought. So they are using resistance strategies. And my other unsung favorite fish, which is a Sacramento split tail, is a remarkable fish. They spawn on the floodplains. Not a lot of floodplain left, but they do. They spawn on the floodplains, and what do? They live a long time. They live 10 years. For a minnow, that's a long time. They live 10 years because they're pretty sure somewhere in that 10 years they're going to get a chance to go nuts on the floodplain. And if you've ever seen split tail going nuts on the floodplain, which I have with Peter Moyle, we stood out there on the Cosumnes floodplain in our waders and watched. It's epic. It is true fish pornography. But the problem is everything we do in water and land management works against those resilience strategies, right? We've disconnected our landscapes. You remember, they've got to move, they got to go long distances, they got to get out in the floodplains. So whether we disconnected them longitudinally with dams or laterally with levees or vertically with groundwater pumping, we have basically disconnected the hydrologic landscape. We also, everybody who manages a dam hates flow variability. That's why you have a dam, to reduce that flow variability. So that loss of natural variability, which produces cues, is important. Water quality changes, big time water quality changes. Too warm where it was cold, too cold where it was warm, too many nutrients. We are the ultimate guest species place in California. The Delta is now 90% of the biomass of the Delta is non-native. There's only 10% of the biomass left is even native. And then loss of genetic diversity. Remember, we got all crazy for hatcheries. We were going to save everything with hatcheries. We have produced the most genetically flabby fish on the planet, trying to keep our commercial and recreational fisheries going. And when those interbreed with wild fish, they kill them. I mean, so it's you've got all of this without genetic variability, you can't save these fish. So we got to introduce it. What we've been writing about, we did a big thing last summer on storing water to the environment. We have got to move away from viewing the environment as a constraint, which is what we do. Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, everything says sets minimum in-stream flow and water quality standards, y'all take the rest. Okay, and it tends to flatline everything. So but you ask somebody who runs a dam, what's their priority? Water supply, hydropower. What's their constraint? The goddamn environment. If you said to them, your priority is the environment, one of your priorities is the environment, they will change the way they operate it. And that's been I'm not going to go into the details of this, but you need good planning and priority setting, and you need to just basically move away from endangered species as your primary guide. Okay, finally, I want to wrap up so we get to some questions. I didn't list this. All three of these sectors depend on us doing a better job of wet year management. And this year is a good year, an example of that. Atmospheric rivers are our future. If you do not have more than about 5 to 7 atmospheric rivers in a year, it doesn't matter how many other storms you had, you're going to have a dry year. You got to have atmospheric rivers in order to have a wet year, and we need to do a much better job of managing that water when it gets here. Also, there are the source of flooding, but that's for another talk. But it's just, without those atmospheric rivers, we are a really dry place, and they're going to increase in intensity, and they're probably going to be concentrated more in the middle of the year. So we have to do a better job of wet year management. And wet year management, I wanted to show you this just to give you an example. See this orange here? So the blue is how much water came into the Sacramento-San Joaquin system in 2017. This orange is how much ran out the Delta. Beyond any environmental standards, we'll charge to the environment, but beyond any environmental standards, you can't tell me that taking 10% of that, which look at it, that would be a pretty impressive amount of water, that would be multiple Folsom dams worth of water, would have any environmental impact. So we really need to do a better job. And no, you will not hear me say we need more dams to do that. It's groundwater. Remember, I told you there's this big empty hole in the ground right now, which is 3 times the size of all the reservoirs in the state. So getting this into the ground is going to be the key thing. And finally, as I told you, this is a happy ending. Oh my God, there's a lot of money out there right now. Year in, year out, we're whining about the lack of funding, limited funding. There is, thanks to that run up during the pandemic, there's a lot of funding. There's over $10 billion available for water, just from the state legislature alone. That's not counting the federal money. There's a lot of money, so much money, we're having a little trouble choking it down, which is, I suppose, is a good thing. All right, so here we have. It is my belief that we're going to be living with less. And it's my conviction that we will be living with less in the future. I also think we're going to be fine, particularly in our cities, because of our capacity for adaptation. Demand management in the city is great, but we're going to have some really major demand management on farms. And increased efficiency. Okay, efficiency of use is extremely important. And yes, there was going to have to be strategic supply investments, particularly in moving water into the ground. People are going to talk about above ground storage. It's not going to make that big a difference. But in alternative supplies like desal, not going to make a big difference. Really, it's going to be smart demand management. We have to remember that these changes impact people's lives, particularly people with limited resources. And for goodness sake, you need to make the environment the third leg of the water stool, cities, farms, and the environment, instead of just a constraint in all of it. And with that, I will answer your questions. Thank you. Okay, so shall we start with questions here? Yep.
So we should all be able to understand and know what a lake looks like behind a dam. So what is going to be a groundwater system? What's it going to look like physically in the future?
I cannot thank you enough for saying that. The number one problem we have with trying to get people to understand groundwater systems is they can't see it. And a legislator can't drive by and point out of the windshield and say, I did that. And they can't stand there for ribbon cutting on it. So you got it. So a groundwater system, okay, so this is not a good example here, but just right nearby here, beneath us, in the space of 400 or 500 feet below us, there are tiny little spaces in what are sediment in here. I mean, and these are sediments that are quite old in here. Those are saturated with water. When we put a well down there, you know, you can draw it into that well and you can pump it up. But every one of these is a basin, meaning it's an area, it's a geographic area where that water is all connected, laterally all connected. So what we are doing now is there are 500 of these basins, more than 500 of these basins in California. I actually showed a map of them, believe it or not. And we're basically trying to develop each individual basin and treat it like a reservoir, putting water in, taking water out, keeping a water balance. You know, when you see lakes rise and fall, it's the amount of water that rises and falls within those basins. We have this law, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that says we have to get our act together by 2040 and have sustainable conditions in our groundwater basins. That seems like a long time. It takes a long time. Groundwater moves much slower than surface water. So I would love to show it to you, but I'd probably kill you in the process of trying to show it to you because it's hundreds of feet below the surface.
Everybody's talking about groundwater recharging. How significant is the loss of groundwater basins due to subsidence and creating impervious
Thank you.
basins?
Thank you. Again, I'm reminded I'm in a room full of adults. So yes, if you haven't heard about this, one of the big issues that's gone on in the San Joaquin Valley in particular, although it's definitely happening in the Sacramento Valley now, is that excess groundwater withdrawal is causing the land to sink. And then what's happening is, you know, I said there's these little pores in that are saturated with water. Well, that water actually kind of holds the sediment together. When you remove it, the sediment collapses. And so those little pores tend to collapse. This doesn't take place in sandstones or sands. It takes place in clay-rich units. And what happens is the clay-rich units will expel their water out as they collapse, because the surrounding water around them has been removed. That collapse, we all freaked out about it when it was happening. We thought that's lost basically usable aquifer down there. Well, it turns out because it's in the clay-rich units, those are not the ones that get a lot of exchange of water on a yearly basis. So the impact is probably overstated. That said, it's a pretty significant impact. Okay. I mean, we tend to think that just because you lost 5 feet of elevation doesn't mean you lost 5 feet of aquifer. And because of it's not the aquifer you would use, okay, that you would be putting water in and taking out, because it's always in these clay-rich layers in which water goes in and out very, very slowly over time. That said, we can see some rebound in areas where we've gotten water back in there because the clays fatten up and they get water in them. But the subsidence itself, which is considered one of the deadly sins in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that subsidence is a multi-million-dollar problem. As you all heard, I mean, this is the classic tragedy of the commons in the San Joaquin Valley. This is mostly farms, but there are some cities out there. But basically, the excess pumping of groundwater, which has caused the land to lower, has changed the slope of the very canals they use to move the water around. And so now they can't move. And the biggest one is the Friant-Kern Canal, which takes water out of the San Joaquin River and moves it into the Kern area. And it was down to a quarter of its capacity. And yet that was the single most important thing, was the ability to convey water and move it around. And in a tragedy of the commons, the groundwater pumping basically destroyed it. But now they're trying to repair it. And we can talk about who's paying for it, but now they're trying to repair it. So it's one of those things.
Right here. I have the mic.
You got to grab that microphone.
Is this on? It's well known that agriculture has fought most of the attempts to get them to, say, be more efficient. They obviously claim it costs too much and it changes things. We have all this money now, and they have a powerful lobby. Last time I looked, their efficiency is about 55% of the water that they get. The rest is wasted evaporation, runoff, et cetera. How do we lever this pressure that we have with less rain, and now we have some water, to get agriculture to become much more efficient? Even 10% increase in agricultural efficiency would go a long ways toward providing more water for the environment and for cities.
Okay, turns out this is a fraught question, and I'll explain why.
Jeff, I'm going to have to just interrupt here for a second. Evidently,
There's a class in
much
here.
to our surprise, there is actually a class that's going to be in here today, needed to be seated at 4. So we have
We have 4 minutes for me to give you a quick answer to that question. Efficiency is in the eye of the beholder. As I told you, groundwater recharge takes place through irrigation. So one farmer's waste is the groundwater that somebody else gets to pump. So in terms of getting that balance through in there, it is very hard. However, agriculture turns out to be very efficient if you look at it economically. They're 4 times more efficient than they were back then. So let me just say that we're going to wrap up and get out of here because children have to come into this room. And I'm sorry this couldn't have gone on for another hour. I would have enjoyed it.